Others have excuses. I have my reasons why. I love that lyric. It comes from a Nickel Creek song. I just did a video and I pretty much explained how I'm not a fan of the Black Lives Matter movement or of the movement for Black Lives or of Antifa because of their actions, but more specifically because of their stated beliefs that they have given in their charters and in their manifestos. I also said that I wasn't a big fan of the use of the term systematic or institutional racism. I don't believe it's accurate when applied to what's going on with the police. But more importantly, I don't believe that it's productive. I don't believe that there's any answer in that. And let me explain why. Recently, past week or two, a representative from Texas, Mr. Al Green, called for a war on racism. And that sounds, it kind of sounds good, a war on racism, get serious about racism. The problem is this is not our first rodeo. You see, LBJ called for a war on poverty in the 1960s. Nixon called for a war on drugs in the 1970s. George Bush called for a war on terrorism at the turn of the millennia. And Obama called for a war on bullying around 2009. And even though these proclamations were made and tons, gobs, billions, trillions of dollars of tax money were spent, we still have poverty and drugs and terrorism and bullying. In fact, it's stronger than ever. You see, they're not effective. And it'll be the same way with a war on racism. You see, whenever somebody, especially a politician, calls for a war on something that's been around since the fall, you can be guaranteed it's one thing. It's a power grab, and it's going to cost us trillions of dollars. It would be like a doctor declaring a war on fevers or a war on nausea. Maybe he could suppress the symptom for a while, but unless you address the cause, then it's a futile endeavor. And so that's why I'm not really big about this idea of this big push against general racism. Jesus even talked to us about this. Remember, Judas rebuked the woman who was pouring oil upon Jesus' feet. And Judas said, this should not have been wasted, but it could have been sold for 40 denarii and used to serve the poor. Now that sounds great that he was going to serve the poor. The problem with this is that the Bible explains he had no concern for the poor. He wanted to have the money in the purse because he pilfered from the purse, which I think fits the description of much of what we've just talked about. It wasn't for an actual love of the cause as much as it was an opportunity to increase power and increase wealth. And so Jesus responded to Judas in an interesting way. He says, the poor you will have with you always, but you will not always have me. She has anointed me for my burial. In other words, she understands first things first. I'm going to be the cure for all of the problems. And the 40 denarii aren't going to touch it. Well, you might be thinking, well, bald guy, you're really good about speaking against things. What would you do? And I think when things don't work, and currently they're not working, we need to go back to the instructions. And when I say things aren't working, I'm specifically meaning, I want to be specific. Things aren't working in African America right now, in the Black America. There's problems. And I think Thomas Sowell did some great work on this, writing on this. And I just want to touch on a couple of points that he made. And I kind of compiled them a little bit, but I thought they were good. It says, in the 1890s, there were 4 public high schools in Washington, D.C. There was one black high school. It was segregated. This is, and it was called Dunbar High School. And there were 3 white high schools. But in 1899, Dunbar averaged higher standardized test scores than 2 of the 3 other white schools. In other words, they were leading the way. In fact, from 1870, get this, all the way through the 50s, Dunbar repeatedly equaled or exceeded performance on nationalized standardized tests. In other words, they were leading the way. But now, by 2005, less than half of black students are graduating from high school. Something broke in the 60s. Look at this. In 1950, 72% of all black men and 81% of black women had been married. Since 1960, up to 77% of black Americans are fatherless. something broke in the 60s. Every census from 1890 through the 1950s showed that the black labor force participation rates were higher than those of whites. And prior to the 60s, the unemployment rate for black teens was below 10%. Since the 60s, the black labor force participation rates have always been lower than whites, and unemployment rates for black teens has never dropped below 20%. Something broke in the 60s. Before 1960, the number of teenage pregnancies had been decreasing. Now, recall, this is back over 50, 60 years ago, and teenage marriages wasn't as big of a deal as it is today. It was more popular then, but teenage pregnancies were decreasing. But since the 60s, 31% of black firstborn children are born to teenage mothers. Something broke in the 60s. Before 1960, both poverty and dependency were declining. Black income was rising both absolute and in relative terms to white income. Since the 60s, the absolute majority of black families with no husband present live in poverty. Something happened in the 60s. Obviously, the country is not more racially divided or racist today than it was back in the 50s. It was obviously more racist back then, and yet the African American community was striving, it was strong, even fighting through that racism. So I don't know that it's the racism, but that's not the worst of it. This is the part that I think that's dealing with all of the noise today. Today, black people account for 13% of the total U.S. population, yet they were victims of almost half, 49% of the nation's murders. And 93% of black murder victims were killed by other black people. Today, blacks in New York constitute 78% of shooting suspects, 74% of shooting victims, even though they're less than 23% of the city's population. And this is tragic. Young black men in New York are 36 times more likely to be murdered than young white men. This is horrendous. Today, black males between the ages of 14 and 17 commit homicide at 10 times the rate of white males and Hispanic males of the same age combined. There's a problem. And when things don't work, you need to go back to the instructions. We had a VBS, and we called it the Bible, the Bible, the Believer's Instruction Book for Living Eternally. You see, the Bible has given us the instructions for addressing problems like this. And the solutions that are present within the Bible, they're going to work in terms of weeks and months, not decades. And there's two primary teachings, I believe, in the Bible that would address the issue that we have right now. The first instruction would be this: family, the nuclear family. Jesus said, "For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother." Not his fathers, not his mothers, his father and mother. "And he would be joined to his wife," not his domestic partner, but his wife. "And the two should become one flesh." Not the two, not three, not four, not five. The two should become one flesh. "Therefore, what God has joined together," this is a spiritual thing, "let no man or government separate," like, I don't know, we'll say no-fault divorce. You see, it's an exquisite definition of the nuclear family, and it works. Because if you notice those statistics, it was a destruction in the nuclear family. And what is kind of upsetting is that the Black Lives Matter movement and the movement for Black Lives both are very overt about their intent to destroy the nuclear family. That's one of the causes. The destruction of the nuclear family is one of the primary causes of what's going on, because the vast, vast, vast majority of crimes committed by young men are committed by young men who had no fathers. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's the biological family. What about someone who doesn't have that family? As we see, the community is already bereft of fathers. Well, that's the second instruction. The second instruction from the Bible is family, but it's a different family. It's called your church family. You see, when your biological family can't meet the needs that you have, then you are to turn to your church family or your spiritual family. Now, Hillary Clinton is very famous for making the quote that it takes a village to raise a child, and that's not true. because I know that there's a lot of people in this village that I don't want anywhere near my children. It takes a church to raise a child. It takes a spiritual community to raise a child. A group of people who are pursuing righteousness. Are they doing it perfectly? No, but they're pursuing righteousness. You see, it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator, God, with certain unalienable rights, which means the government needs to keep their mitts off of them. Among these are life. Why? Because life matters? No, because life is sacred. All life is sacred because it's made in the image of God. Life is sacred. Liberty. Liberty means that governments need to be kept in check. Their purpose is just to provide liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to own arms, freedom to own property. You see, freedom, small government, big freedoms, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is not what we mean today when we say the pursuit of happiness. It would make sense that God gives every man the unalienable right to pursue hedonistic pleasure, because that's kind of what a lot of people think happiness is today. In the 1700s, the concept of happiness came from the Greek word. And what it meant more, it might be better translated, righteousness. That God gives to man the freedom to pursue righteousness, to pursue a relationship with God in accordance with his own conscience and dictates. And so the idea here is that we need a spiritual community. This is what changed me. I have a wonderful family. I love my family, but when I was growing up, we weren't necessarily a spiritual family. And so there were certain aspects of things I didn't know what to do with. And when I got saved and I got involved in a church family, I met men and women who were righteous, and they provided me, they filled in the gaps, if you will. And because of this, and because I was so impacted by their love for me and their attention to me, that's what I've been doing. It's not like I'm just saying words. I've spent over 3 decades dedicating my life to doing this type of thing, whether it be being a nursery volunteer or a children's ministry worker, or whether it's been Boy Scouts or Royal Rangers or foreign missions or summer camps or youth ministry or Christian education or counseling. I've been pouring out my life to try to pour into other young people, because it's God's plan for civilization. God's plan for civilization is family, biological family, and church family, spiritual community. This is the plan for the foundations of civilization. And when you get things out of context, there's a great thing, maybe we'll go into it some other time, called sphere sovereignty, that there's a purpose for government and a purpose for church and a purpose for marriage and a purpose for family and a purpose for the market. And that within those spheres of authority, there's a responsibility. And that if you try to take on somebody else's responsibility, you try to take on the action of another sphere, it's not going to work very well. It'd be like driving a screw with a hammer. I mean, you might be able to accomplish it, but it's not accordance with the design or the purpose. And so I just wanted to clarify that. I believe that we've got problems that need to be addressed. But can I tell you, the only one who can address them is Jesus and the gospel. Now, you might say, well, you poured in all that time. Did you do it perfectly? Not by a long shot. But did everybody follow? No. But that's not the point. The power of the gospel is not in its presentation. The power of the gospel isn't upon the willingness of the recipient. The power of the gospel is the love and blood of Jesus Christ. It's the only thing that's going to change things. And when we get away from the instructions, we get what we got out there right now, garbage. Look what's happened in the past couple months. It's absolutely insane. Well, that's the second part of my rant. I hope it gives you a little bit of my idea of what the solution is. So be blessed.